Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. The website is aroundtheempire.com. This is listener-supported independent media. Pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Follow on Twitter @aroundtheempire, and subscribe to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. Max Blumenthal joins us today to discuss his new book, The Management of Savagery: How America's National Security State Fueled the Rise of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Donald Trump. Here's an excerpt from the promo for the book. Quote, "The Rise of International Jihad and Western Ultra-nationalism." In The Management of Savagery, Max Blumenthal excavates the real story behind America's dealings with the world and shows how the extremist forces that now threaten peace across the globe are the inevitable flowering of America's imperial designs. Washington's secret funding for the mujahedin provoked the Russian invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. With guns and money, the United States has ever since sustained the extremists, including Osama Bin Laden, who have become its enemies. The Pentagon has trained and armed jihadist elements in Afghanistan, Syria, and Libya. It has launched military interventions to change regimes in the Middle East. In doing so, it created fertile ground for the Islamic State and brought foreign conflicts home to American soil. These failed wars abroad have made the United States more vulnerable to both terrorism as well as native ultra-nationalism. The Trump presidency is the inevitable consequence of neoconservative imperialism in the post-Cold War age. Trump's dealings in the Middle East are likely to only exacerbate the situation, unquote. So this interview became a longer and more wide-ranging discussion than we had anticipated, and a really interesting one at that. Not only did we talk about the book and what we think is one of the biggest scandals in American history, but we also talked about the rise of anti-interventionism, both as a generational movement and a general awakening. And by the way, the current positions taken by Democratic candidates for the 2020 presidential election also comes up in the conversation. In part 2 of the interview, we discussed our own evolutions and how we came to understand the role of the U.S. and the empire in the world. We ventured into what we think are the best practices for helping others who are in varying states of their own awakening. And Max then explains that how the book, The Management of Savagery, is actually a compilation of his new understanding of the U.S. role in the world. This interview is split into 2 parts. This is part 1. And we recorded this on June 14th, 2019. Max Blumenthal's here speaking to us from Washington, D.C. Hi, Max. Congratulations on your new book, and thanks for coming on the show to talk about it.
Thanks for having me on.
So first of all, Max has clearly struck a nerve with this book, something he's never done before, of course, right? And I found out this kind of personally when his first, I think it was the first book event in Washington, was canceled. Well, I guess technically it was postponed at the last minute. And I happened to be on an Amtrak train at that time on my way to that book event at Politics Press. Remember that day?
Yeah.
So to be fair, I was traveling to Washington for another event, and I decided to come a day early, go see Max's book talk, and visit with my son too. So, but let's talk about that a little bit before we get into the meat of the book itself, Max. I think it would be like enlightening and relevant to hear about the kinds of pressure and the censorship that you've experienced with this book, and from whom. I mean, it's all part of a bigger story. The fact that this has been suppressed, I think, is sort of part of the bigger story. So, what happened, and what kind of, are you still getting pressure on your book events, or has that calmed down?
No, I mean, there's ongoing pressure, and, I'll learn something new every few days about, why Democracy Now! Wouldn't have me on, or
Wow.
I'll wake up and see that some British pundit, actually it was someone named Grace Blakely, who I'd never heard of before, but who's apparently kind of a prominent Corbynite, rising young economist who's sort of democratic socialist in the UK, had gone on Twitter and praised my book as the best book of the year and an excoriating look at the foreign policy of Britain, France, and the US. And then, she deletes her tweet and denounces me under pressure from British neocons who are also contributors to the magazine she works at, the Daily Statesman. So it's like, and then she denounces me as an Assad apologist or something. And, basically, when you look at the suppression campaign, it really is contingent on sort of center-left people or highly ambitious lefty people self-censoring under pressure from these hardcore regime change lobbyists because they don't fully understand the Syrian catastrophe and they're not willing to take a stand on it. And so even if they read my book and they find it compelling, they have to worry about, number one, their own career and their own ambitions, because it's not something that really is popular in sort of centrist establishment circles that they want to have a voice in. And number two, what I'm saying is it diverges so strongly from their own understanding, which is based on the war that's been sold to us as a one-sided slaughter with this dictator petting a cat in some like evil bat cave, just killing people for fun. That they wonder if maybe I actually am, I'm the one responsible for the disinformation and not the regime change lobbyists who are bearing down on them. So, in my conversation with the owners of Politics and Prose, which is sort of the main, I would say, sort of progressive branded bookstore in DC that hosts pretty much any major author who's coming to DC for a book tour. And I've done my last 3 book launches there. They were just sort of startled, not just at the response my book got, which was an organized response organized by the Syrian American Council, which is the American wing of the Syrian National Council. And it's basically a regime change war lobbying organization that has done organizing sessions with the Cuban American National Foundation in Miami, basically the Miami Mafia, and is, a right-wing war lobby organization. But it was also, the Twitter trolls who have obsessed over Syria, even the founder of the White Helmets, James Le Mercier, who basically stationed himself in southern Turkey and became an integral part of the kind of British military intelligence apparatus that was shipping arms and basically providing civil society apparatus to the Islamist insurgents who were taking over swaths of territory in Syria. He actually tweeted at Politics and Prose, I think several times, demanding they cancel my event. So you talk to these owners and they're like, well, they say you're spouting disinformation and we don't know what to think, but it really, it really does seem like they may have a case here and we don't know. And they just are kind of befuddled and startled, and they're afraid of, that there's could be a security situation. And, it took basically this coming to light and getting publicized for there to be enough pushback for them to realize, oh, well, there is a strong constituency in support of hearing what Max has to say. And in the middle of all of this, they can't examine the facts, and they can't even consider that no one has disputed a single fact I've reported. And it's actually as though a person who was exposing the dangers of tobacco and its role in causing lung cancer was being attacked by tobacco lobbyists, or a scientist who had evidence of chronic traumatic encephalopathy or head trauma in former NFL players was being intimidated by the NFL. It was, I would say it was analogous to that, but they couldn't draw that conclusion because of the way that Syria has been portrayed in the American mind, and particularly the way that it's been marketed to people who are kind of coastal, cosmopolitan, middle-class liberals through these influence operations like the White Helmets. So basically, the people who were lobbying for war were afraid of my book getting too much currency because they appeared on its pages. Charles Lister, the fake expert, uh, at the Middle East Institute, whose job was to vet the supposed moderate rebels for David Cameron and the MI6 and the CIA, um, and got everything wrong and fudged numbers and made up this fake number of 70,000 moderate rebels, including which also included, Kurdish fighters from the YPG who had nothing to do with the fight against Assad. And, this guy was lobbying politics in prose against my talk, of course, because there's a long section exposing his his sham research. And so, and there's a whole section in my book on, the role of Gulf-funded think tanks, the same Gulf states that were propping up the rebels, in fostering fake research from people like Charles Lister. So it was a very obvious situation to me and to a lot of other people. In the end, what wound up happening was Politics in Prose postponed my talk. I had already set up another talk, and so they wound up kind of co-sponsoring it, selling books there. They donated the profits from my books to some free speech organization. It infuriated the regime change lobbyists trying to shut down my talk, and I sold lots of books. My book is currently sold out and going into a reprint. So it was really thanks to these characters, thanks to this rabid mob, that I was able to get my book out there, and this whole campaign completely backfired on them. And I predicted months before to my publishers that this would take place. So they just kind of played right into my hands. I guess it's sort of satisfying in that way.
Yeah, it did draw more attention to it. And I mean, you said they didn't dispute any of the facts in your book. And a lot of these things are hidden in plain sight. Like a lot of things with foreign policy, they're hidden in plain sight, but the masses, or most Americans, are not likely to seek out or find those things. But really, what you're exposing, in my view, is, and others have exposed too, but you've put it all together in one place here and made a very good argument and connected a lot of different events. And a lot of these events are now things are in many of us in our adult memory, but it's, in my view, I mean, it's hard to say what's the biggest scandal in American history, but if this isn't it, it's close to it. And so I think the regime change war was a massive mistake for the empire for a lot of reasons. One of them is that Syria changed everything. Now, that's a long conversation, but the one specific aspect of it that I'd like to zero in on is the exposure of this very twisted relationship with Al Qaeda. For nearly 20 years now, an enormous amount of resources have been expended to condition the American public, to blame, to fear, to hate, and to want to exact revenge on Al Qaeda for 9/11, right? And Al Qaeda provided a windfall for the war machine. The authorization to use military force passed by Congress, used by three presidents now to wage war sort of wherever we want to in the world, as long as it could be construed as a war against Al Qaeda or somebody responsible in some way for 9/11. And this worked really well for a long time until Syria. And the curtain began to be pulled back. Some foreign policy gurus and former generals like Petraeus even tried to propose to the public, that maybe we should temporarily ally with Al Qaeda. Yeah. And special forces or special operations forces leaked their complaints to former military guys now in the media business, like Jack Murphy, about how pissed off they were that they were required to train jihadists, to be part of our proxy army or our friends' proxy army, and how they deliberately, did things to undermine that mission, of this training mission. So that, the cat was out of the bag, sort of. Most people still use this bumbling empire myth. Shucks, some of those weapons made their way to Al Qaeda and ISIS.
Fell into the hands of.
Yeah. And, that might explain some of it, but over time, it just wasn't sufficient to explain what we were seeing with our own eyes. So, um, talk about that, because I think it really is, it can't be explained enough. If you can, I think, you're good at boiling things down, but if you could sort of tell us about that evolution and how we got to this point and how it's now somewhat out in the open, but still being suppressed, like in ways that you just experienced yourself.
Well, yeah, a lot of Americans can't believe that the organization that was responsible for 9/11 was receiving arms from the United States intelligence, through its intelligence services, in order to fight, as Jake Sullivan, the former advisor to Hillary Clinton, foreign policy advisor, said, on our side in Syria. It wrote a gleeful email to Hillary Clinton in 2012 stating that Al Qaeda is on our side in Syria. And that's tradition. That's sort of not surprising if you've assessed how the United States, in covert operations in Central Asia and the Middle East, has related to jihadist or Salafi jihadi organizations over the past decades, especially during the latter phase of the Cold War. 9/11 kind of disrupted the traditionally cozy relationship between the CIA and organizations like Al Qaeda, and sort of forced this quote unquote war on terror on the US, which basically became a war of terror on the few recalcitrant states left in the Middle East that resisted the US sphere of influence, instead of organizations like Al Qaeda, and wound up emboldening them and fueling the rise of ISIS. So in Syria, we had what was basically a reboot of Operation Cyclone, the multi-billion-dollar operation to arm and train the Afghan mujahedin, which also featured a Saudi matching fund that brought figures like Osama bin Laden and the blind sheikh, Omar Abdul Rahman, to the Afghan battlefield through the Services Bureau in cooperation with Pakistani intelligence, and created the basis for Al Qaeda. And Operation Cyclone became Operation Timber Sycamore in Syria. One out of every $13 the CIA received through its black budget, which the public has no ability to vote on or even review, was going to this arm and equip operation of supposedly moderate rebels. And the US public was being sold this lie that the moderate rebels were actually going to fight Assad and ISIS, and that if we don't support them sufficiently, that they would actually, that ISIS would take over. Samantha Power actually made this argument in a really shocking situation that has been sort of overlooked and gone down the Orwellian memory hole, but which I resurrected in my book, or excavated in my book. And it was a hearing in the House, and it was actually Adam Schiff, of all people, the Grand Inquisitor of Russiagate, who was angrily questioning Samantha Power, because Adam Schiff represents areas in and around LA, including Glendale, which is home to the largest Armenian population outside of Armenia. And a village called Kasab had been ethnically cleansed by Jabhat al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, which was getting heavy weapons through Turkey from the United States. And Schiff wanted to know what the U.S. was doing about this, because this was an Armenian Christian village. I think they'd lived there for over 1,000 years, their families. And Samantha Power said, well, we are coordinating with, the moderate rebels and the Free Syrian Army to make sure that these extremist groups don't take the leadership. And at the time, I think it was one of the leaders of the Syrian National Council, one of the Islamist leaders, was in Istanbul praising al-Qaeda's takeover of this village explicitly, and called for these Christians to leave, because this was the plan, this was the project. And the Free Syrian Army, as the U.S. would later have to admit, was basically a weapons farm for al-Qaeda and ISIS. But by admitting it, they were actually admitting what was widely known within intelligence circles. In 2015, thanks to our friend Brad Hoff, we learned about the Defense Intelligence Agency report overseen by the now disgraced Michael Flynn, which warned of a Salafist principality emerging in northeastern Syria if the U.S. continued dumping weapons in through its regional allies of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. And that's precisely what happened later that year, and Raqqa became the capital of that Salafist principality known as the Islamic State. How did Raqqa get taken over? Well, it was Free Syrian Army fighters backed by the CIA marching in alongside fighters from Jabhat al-Nusra. And once they took the town, Jabhat al-Nusra imposed a harsh theocratic order. It's what the scholar of Syria, Joshua Landis, calls Talibanization, where basically even the so-called revolutionary activists were all basically jailed and driven out or killed. And Jabhat al-Nusra is revealed as a Trojan horse for the Islamic State. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi emerges as the caliph, and the rest, the Free Syrian Army fighters, the so-called moderate rebels, either go upfield to fight Syrian government soldiers, or they join up with the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda because these are the best fighters and the ones with the most weapons. And this, again, it's a traditional relationship. I interviewed Vincent Canestraro, who was a CIA field operative during Operation Cyclone, who was really in the room for a lot of the major decisions, including to send Stinger missiles to the mujahedin. And I asked him, why did the U.S. give so much money, over $600 million, to Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who basically was, not just one of the most brutal and ruthless figures among the warlords, but was also one of the most ideologically extreme, the most in line with the thinking of figures like Bin Laden. And he said because him and his men were just the best fighters, and that's all we cared about. And it was the same in Syria. The best fighters were not going to be, these, middling characters like Salam Idris, who we wanted to put before the cameras when he met with John McCain, who were former low-level Syrian army officers. They were people who wanted to Islamicize or Talibanize Syria, who really had ideological zeal and who actually had the training. You even had a blowback effect in Syria through characters like Omar al-Shishani, who was trained. This is a Dagestani fighter who was a leader of the Islamic State, who went to Syria, who had been trained by the U.S. in Georgia, actually, to fight proxy wars on Russia's frontiers, came into Syria and wound up taking over the Meneg air base. This is another really significant incident that I outline in my book that shows cooperation between the CIA's rebels, the ones that it trained, and the Islamic State, because the CIA-backed rebels of the Free Syrian Army, who were led by Jamal Abdul al-Qaidi, this was a general that was one of the favorites of the U.S., who was getting tons of CIA money, had surrounded the Meneg air base, which was an isolated Syrian army air base. But they couldn't take it because they were lousy. They're just not that motivated, and they're just kind of hanging out. So Shishani comes in, the Islamic State fighter with his guys, helps them take it, and then they do a press conference together. Al-Qaidi, the CIA's guy, and Shishani, who had basically been trained by the CIA but was Islamic State. And this was really embarrassing for the U.S. because 2 weeks before, Robert Ford, the fake U.S. ambassador to Syria, had been doing press conferences with Al-Qaidi. And so you can juxtapose the photo of Robert Ford with Al-Qaidi, the CIA's man in Syria, and Omar al-Shishani, the Islamic State's man there, who had actually been, and Al-Qaidi, and it just draws the perfect connection. And how this whole thing worked out. And then after the taking of the Meneg air base, Al-Qaidi delivers an interview, I forget to which station, and says the Islamic State are our brothers, and we don't really have any disagreements with them. And this is something you hear again and again from various rebels. There was some Turkish-backed character, whose name I forget, who was in a Vice special in Syria, who said, our goal is the same as the Islamic State, that we're going to take over this country and make it an Islamic theocracy. He is brought to Washington by Charles Lister at a time when Trump was talking about defunding the Arm and Equip program to basically lobby for more arms, and he appears on stage with Lister at the Middle East Institute. So it's just, I mean, I could go on and on about it,
Yeah.
but as you said, this is one of the biggest scandals in American history. We haven't seen the end of it, and it's treated as if it sort of never happened. And you can really see that in reaction to Tulsi Gabbard and her candidacy, because she is attacked mercilessly for what she did in Syria, but the pundits and the sort of Beltway media class don't understand what she was doing there. It's just unfathomable to them that we were supporting groups like Jabhat al-Nusra or Arar al-Sham, Nouraddin al-Zinki, which sawed the head off of a 19-year-old Palestinian teen on camera, and then entered into a coalition with a militia called the Bin Laden Front. These groups were supported by the CIA. That's unfathomable in Washington. And when Tulsi Gabbard introduced her Stop Arming Terrorists Act in 2017, it got no attention. It was completely ignored. But that's why she'd been in Syria, was to draw attention to this scandal and then to attempt to gain some kind of public accountability over the CIA's black budget, which is voted on in the House Appropriations Committee in a rubber stamp fashion. And the public, again, has no ability to review it. So I thought what Tulsi Gabbard was doing was very brave, but also really necessary. And she's just kind of laughed at and demonized. There was this piece I read in New York Magazine, which
Yeah, I just read that the other day.
it basically attributes her views on Syria to a psychopathology that derives from her childhood upbringing in a cult and to her communist grandfather. It was just I mean, I read it as the author's analysis as pathological, but the author is treating anti-war tendencies or anti-imperialism as a form of psychosis, and clearly doesn't understand what Syria was about at all.
Well, yeah, but the author, well, I mean, this is a whole nother conversation, but she does. My head was spinning when I finished reading that thing, because she also, I think, to try to establish some credibility and to make it look like she wasn't attacking Tulsi Gabbard, she started going after the blob and
Yeah.
the
Well,
the war machine.
the
You
author's
know,
a self-described lipstick libertarian. So
but at the end there, she almost tries to bring you back around to think, oh, I'm not. This isn't a smear. Um, but nobody's going to remember anything about that part of the article. They're only going to remember the shocking, right from the very first paragraph. That's often how you can
well,
pick
the
out.
title of the article is Tulsi Gabbard had a very
Yeah,
strange childhood. It's
yeah.
like, let's not talk about the biggest scandal in one of the biggest scandals in recent U.S. history that she tried to take on. Let's not talk about that. Let's talk about her childhood. I mean, that really sums up how, the sort of I mean, this is a libertarian writing it, but it reminds me of the way the liberal intelligentsia treats anti-war voices as just kind of disturbed and fringe, and then they try to go into they don't address what they say on the merits. Actually, at the end of the article, the author, her name is Howley or something, she
Yeah.
she said, well, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, it matters what Tulsi Gabbard does, and she's trying to take on the war machine, and that's all we can look at. But she had just spent thousands of
Yes.
words of psychobabble painting Tulsi Gabbard as some kind of circus freak from a far off Polynesian island, who had been living in a Jonestown style cult for much of her life with a
Well,
Stalin grandfather.
yeah, and I think the other thing that she really tried to embed in your mind was that Tulsi might not be acting out of her own agency.
Right.
She's still being representing this underground political movement since the 70s. I mean, she had to dig up stuff from the 1970s, plus some uh, other independent journalist and special education teacher who she cited in the article, she came after her on Twitter and started accusing her of plagiarism. I mean, she, which is a whole, a whole nother thing. But this woman who comes after her she was also going after. She's the one who dug up all this information. But
Right.
also, they use the anonymous source, and then they also go and they get the disgruntled aunt, this family member who is estranged, and what, for whatever reason, they use her as a source too. It was really, really ugly.
Well, this is how this is how you make a name for yourself: is you attack the one candidate who's really a threat, who's also a fringe candidate, doesn't have a political machine that can hurt you. And I see a lot of journalists going after Tulsi Gabbard, or pundits going after her, and really like leaving Biden off the hook. I remember when Rudy Giuliani was going to get on his flight to go investigate Biden in Ukraine, it was treated as some kind of joke because
I remember
Giuliani's become a farcical character, but there actually is something there. There's a
Yeah.
lot. That's another gigantic scandal, is
Yeah.
Biden's activity in Ukraine and what the U.S. has done in Ukraine. And the way that's treated versus Tulsi Gabbard's trip to Syria is really telling. So, I'm just trying to make a larger point, which is that anyone who has tried to unearth this scandal and bring it out for the public to see and make a judgment on is going to be mercilessly attacked, and those who do the attacking are going to be rewarded. So that's what we're seeing with Tulsi Gabbard. And I just saw the debate lineup. It's really unfortunate that she won't be on the same stage as Joe Biden, because
She
that
won't.
is a perfect foil for her. Yeah, I mean, it was surprising that the two-tiered Democratic debates don't feature the top-tier characters who are polling the highest. There isn't kind of a B team debate. It's a mixture. So there is a chance for some kind of something subversive to take place, but it's unfortunate she won't be on stage with Biden. In any case, I can see some of the characterizations of her, being somewhat interesting or relevant, but I really was reminded of the way that I've been treated ever since I started taking on Israel in the Israel lobby when I wrote Goliath, which is to be you're pathologized. People just call you a psychopath, or try to mock you, but they never engage your arguments on the merits. They reject open debate. It's just this classic McCarthyite tendency. And I saw that in the way that Tulsi Gabbard's being treated.
Yeah. And I think it's they're still not that worried about her. So this is probably only beginning of
Absolutely. Yeah.
God only knows what though. I just met her last Saturday. I was at the New York, at the New York event in the morning on Saturday. This is the one where they had crowds going around the block.
Yeah.
So I met her briefly too. Afterwards, I met her sister. I saw the people around her campaign. So it was, the New York Magazine thing was particularly shocking to me because I had just seen these people and spoken to them in real life, and I didn't find them to be strange at all. I found them to be particularly warm and, down to earth, and treated Tulsi basically split the event in half. She just, when she realized she couldn't fit everybody because the venue wasn't that big, she left I was in the first batch, and she left everyone in the room, and she said, I'm going to go outside. She went outside, she talked to people, and then she told them, look, I'm going to split this in. She went to great lengths to try to address everyone who was there, so I thought that was just,
it's a protest candidacy, and the candidacy is about introducing issues into the debate that wouldn't otherwise be there, and or pushing Bernie from the left on foreign policy. I mean, that's how I see it. And this author at New York Magazine portrayed Tulsi Gabbard as kind of someone who doesn't know what they're doing or why they're there, and that she wasn't getting a strong response on the foreign policy points, and that the crowd was waiting for her to make points on Medicare that they wanted to hear that were relevant.
No, that's not true.
That's not what I'm getting at all, and it's not what I'm getting in my own work. At the Gray Zone, the site that I edit, we're just getting massive engagement because there's this void out there, and there are very few sites that are doing the work we're doing, and there's a hunger for it. There's a
That's right.
hunger for anti-imperialist journalism and politicians who are willing to take on the concept of the U.S. as an empire and to, call on uh, small r Republican ideals. I think that are just deeply embedded in the American public. And in a way, she's a bigger threat than someone like Ron Paul, who could be written off as kind of an anti-government kook or a racist. And so when she first announced, the disinformation campaign really took place on the left in quarters like Jacobin or The Intercept, which is run by her or owned by her longtime adversary in Hawaii, Pierre Omidyar. And it was to paint her as a racist or as an Islamophobe or as a homophobe, and to basically deter the natural anti-war base from becoming part of her base and propelling her campaign above 2%. And, I saw a lot of kind of hardcore Bernie Sanders zealots attacking her because, maybe in the back of their mind, they saw her as a threat to him or something. But there were so many people who were just falling for this disinformation campaign. And it really speaks to, I think, the weakness of anti-war politics in the U.S., how vulnerable it is to this kind of internal fragmentation. But in any case, we'll see what happens with the debates. She does appear on the pages of my book. I went to her press conference where she announced the Stop Arming Terrorists Act, and wrote about my encounter with Tima Kurdi, who Tulsi Gabbard had brought to Washington. And Tima Kurdi is the aunt, the Canadian Kurdish aunt of one of the most iconic victims of the Syrian proxy war.
Oh, yeah.
Alan Kurdi, who washed up on the beach in Bodrum in Turkey dead. He was just a small boy whose crumpled body was featured on newspaper covers across the world. It really became a symbol of the plight of refugees. And, there was an attempt by the regime change lobby to spin that image against the Syrian government. Tima Kurdi told me she was actually approached by the PR group behind the White Helmets, and they wanted her to kind of go on a campaign. And she said, no, I don't like the Syrian government because I'm Kurdish, but they're fighting against ISIS. And the reason that my family left Syria was because of ISIS. They were actually fleeing from Kobani, which was under assault from ISIS. And so, Tima Kurdi went to Washington, did some interviews with MSNBC because she was a known figure. And what she said was, so inconvenient and so dissonant to what corporate media had been expected to hear about Syria, which is that we need to stop sending weapons to Syria because that's why the refugees are leaving. That's what's destabilizing the country. That's why there's a war, and there will be a war as long as we keep these weapons flowing in. We really never heard from her again after that. But I just said, Tulsi Gabbard's been portrayed as anti-refugee. And if that's the case, why did she bring one of the most forceful advocates for refugees to Washington? The whole point, the book, is to provide context on issues like the refugee crisis and to help people understand in a more sophisticated way, in a historical and political way, why we've seen the worst refugee crisis since World War II. And it's just such an inconvenient topic because we meaning the United States, fueled that refugee crisis by militarizing rebellion in Syria.
Right. And just to get to how it's becoming more and more difficult to keep this under wraps. Like there are thousands or millions of Syrians, Kurdish Syrians, Arab Syrians, Christian Syrians who know that story that she was telling, right? And if we just had a few of them on TV, you'd get that point of view all the time. But it's even so, even with that kind of suppression, it's becoming more and more difficult to hide. Now, back in the day, like the blind sheikh, right? That they in the 90s, they were able to still keep that under wraps pretty much. I myself didn't know much about that story until, fairly recently. But the question is, why is it harder to hide here? Why do they have to go to such great lengths to suppress people, to hide it? And I've heard you talk about this before, and I agree with this point of view is that, as the empire's in decline, the curtain is being pulled back. Now, you know, greed, hubris, even the natural decline of an unsustainable empire, though it probably could have been sustained for longer if greed and like addiction to power and corruption had been kept in check, more in check. It makes things harder to hide. And because it makes things harder to hide, you have to crack down more. Plus, I guess there's the obvious. We have the internet now. We have, everyone has cameras. We talk to people around the world all the time. Whereas, within my lifetime, we were just talking about this recently with my partner that, like to leave the country, you had to drive. Some people had to drive hundreds of miles, like to get to an airport where you could fly out of the country.
Right.
It used to be very difficult to make a phone call when I was a teenager on a school trip to Italy, and just what I had to do just to make a phone call home. In a hotel, you had to go down to the hotel desk, and it was crazy. But now I talk to people in other countries every day, or almost every day. Just online and encounter people and all that. So it makes sense that it's harder to hide these things. But I think it is the empire in decline that is causing this curtain to be pulled back on this. Do you agree with that, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, in the past, we had sort of oligarchs behind the curtain controlling the presidency through various means. Now you just have one who's president. So that's pretty much says it all. And the way that Trump interacts with the media is, I mean, there's just this great mask lifting where he said, of course I would accept some help on, this week, the big scandal is, of course, I would accept some help on a campaign from a foreign government if they approached me. I mean, that happens all the time in Washington. And yeah, it does happen all the time. Anyone who says otherwise is denying the influence of the Israel lobby in literally deciding congressional races. And, so Trump's just kind of bringing it all out. And the outrage is derived from American exceptionalism and this notion that Trump is this kind of anomaly when he's actually just reflecting the way that, Washington elites have behaved for decades, or traditionally since the founding of the republic. So, yeah, I mean, the mask lifting in Syria is really extreme. I mean, what we're witnessing with the OPCW report, the so-called engineers report, pouring cold water on the idea that chemical weapons were used in Duma. This is exploding into a scandal, at least in Europe. It's not really being reported in the U.S., but it's becoming pretty clear that the U.S. went to war on false pretenses or not went to war, but bombed Syria on false pretenses over Duma, and that the OPCW actually lied about Ian Henderson, who issued the dissenting report, asserting that no chemical attack took place and that the entire incident may have been staged, that he actually participated in the research and was part of the investigating mechanism on Duma. This is all coming out into the open. And so this week, when Mike Pompeo and the Trump administration claimed that two tankers, including a Japanese tanker in the Gulf of Oman, were attacked by Iran as Khamenei met with Shinzo Abe in Japan, in Tehran on this historic visit, first Japanese visit to Iran in 40 years. The whole narrative just fell apart because the public wasn't willing to buy it. And the term Gulf of Tonkin was actually trending on Twitter.
I know.
So there's just this deep-seated suspicion about claims made by the government that are taking us to war. There's an understanding, at least among people who are sort of politically conscious, of, when you use phrases like Kuwaiti incubator babies, they know what it is. There's just this general suspicion, but there's also this kind of hatred of empire that Trump capitalized on when he campaigned in 2016.
Yep.
I think, there's no way to put that back in the bag. Like this kind of unipolar triumphalism that we experienced in the 1990s after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union is completely gone. And someone like Joe Biden just doesn't understand that at all. And it would just be amazing to see him try to campaign in this environment in a general election against Trump. I just kind of can't imagine it. But
he's actually co-opting some of Trump's campaign message from 2016. It's really bizarre to watch. He's like, "Make America America again."
Yeah,
and
that was actually John Kerry's message in 2004, and he was quoting Langston Hughes.
oh, all
Let
right.
America be America, but they're trying to, but and I mean, if he is saying that, it kind of reminds me of Hillary Clinton saying America is already great, which
Right.
is that kind of triumphalist 1990s Clintonian attitude that nobody can relate to anymore.
Yeah, and you can sense it all through. You could sense it all through the 2016 campaign. You can sense it in the foreign policy too. Just people dredging up old ideas, old philosophy, and just trying to force it down the throat of all of us and the entire world, for that matter. And with each passing year, I think you talked about this sort of this resentment and this sort of hate for this whole imperial thing. I mean, well, first of all, we were all told for our entire lives that we're not an empire, we're like the opposite of an empire. The other thing is that I think, and this is not constantly denied, there's almost like what they called a silent majority in a whole nother context. But there is. We talked about the anti-war movement being so easy to fragment and co-opt and everything else, but I am really beginning to think that there is an anti-war movement, less anti-war than anti-interventionist, anti-imperial, but under it's not like the ones we've seen in the past. You may not see everyone out on the streets, but when Obama was being pressured to go in and bomb the hell out of Assad and, just get that regime change over with, I have heard, including Lawrence Wilkerson, people talk about how they were on Capitol Hill at the time, and that the response in every possible way, phone calls, visits, faxes, an enormous, enormous response from all kinds of Americans. And I can remember Walter Jones saying that for the first time in his congressional career, he was getting phone calls from active military. He's got military bases in his district. They weren't giving his names, and of course Walter Jones wasn't going to ask for the names, but they were active military calling and begging him to stop this from happening. So maybe it isn't a million people out on the streets in New York, but it's still there, and everyone knows it's there. Trump certainly knows it was there. They may have denied that was a big part of why he won, but certainly the people trying to smear Tulsi Gabbard know it. And so I think there is a silent majority kind of situation going on in this country. And those of us who might despair about the absence of an anti-war movement should really maybe start looking at this a different way and start talking to people regardless of partisanship. Ditch the partisanship. There's all kinds of common ground on anti-interventionist policies.
Yeah, if you remember the 2008 Republican South Carolina primary, all the areas that lit up for Ron Paul were where there were military bases. The soldiers wanted to vote for the guy who wasn't going to send them to redeploy in Anbar province or wherever it was.
Afghanistan, yeah.
Afghanistan. I mean, I feel it out there. I was just on a speaking tour in southern Florida, mostly on Venezuela, and I was thinking, I'm going to southern Florida. I'm going to the heart of the beast. I mean, this is where the Venezuelan right-wing exile community that wants the U.S. to launch a military intervention on their former country is. This is where the Cuban lobby is. This is where the right-wing Nicaragua lobby is. This is where Bolton goes to meet with, the veterans of the Bay of Pigs. And, I did a
Marco
talk.
Rubio.
Yeah, Rubio. I mean, I spoke in Coral Gables across the street from the hotel where Bolton actually met with the Bay of Pigs veterans. And we had a pretty sizable crowd. This is one of 3 events I did that was filled mostly with Cubans, Puerto Ricans, even a few Venezuelans, and then, your local kind of anti-war activists community. And,
A lot of young, if that's the one I just
mostly young.
watched, a lot of young people. Yeah.
I actually didn't know it was online.
There's some kind of there was a video from at a university in Florida.
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, I spoke at Florida International.
Okay, that's the one I saw.
That was, a smaller crowd, but, I was on stage with a young Cuban radio host who is completely dedicated her life to opposing the U.S. embargo on her country. And, we had all kinds of students show up to this who some of them were new to the topic, and then some of them were, anti-imperialists, I would say. And we have to draw a distinction between, anti-war and anti-imperialism.
Yeah,
now,
we do.
I think that's what you were hinting at, because the wars the U.S. is fighting around the globe are hybrid wars that entail sanctions and information warfare. Sanctions is essentially financial terrorism against Venezuela, against Iran, and shows of force. And so you have like a plurality, at least in Congress, who are willing to stand up and say that, probably a majority, that Congress should authorize any intervention against Venezuela. You even have Republicans taking the lead on this. I forget his name, but the senator from Indiana has been a real leader on congressional authorization on Venezuela. That's just about war, but there's very little opposition to sanctions. And sanctions are having the same effect that a conventional war might have on Venezuela. If you believe the Center for Economic and Policy Research's study by Mark Weisbrot and Jeffrey Sachs, that between 2017 and 2018, there were 40,000 excess deaths due to U.S. sanctions in Venezuela.
Yeah,
So
we should mention that this is a good time to mention that Iran is making very clear that sanctions are war.
absolutely.
And possibly responding to them in the only ways that they can. So
anyway, what I saw in South Florida was really a movement against empire, and a breath of fresh air. People there were telling me, this is something. That they have this coalition that's come together, and it's sort of new. And a lot of the Cuban Americans who've been intimidated into silence by the Cuban lobby are now speaking out and joining the coalition. Wherever I go, I experience that, and it kind of goes hand in hand with the rising interest among youth, millennial youth, Generation Z, whatever you want to call them, in socialism, because if you get into Democratic Socialists from America or of America, DSA, you're not immediately inculcated into an anti-imperialist narrative. They try to sort of adopt this sort of Scandinavian style socialism. And then you realize that socialist experiments that are taking place in places like Venezuela are under attack by the US. And you have to decide, do I show solidarity for that? And how do we react as an organization? Then there are other organizations which are actually involved in showing solidarity with Venezuela. And you have to decide what kind of socialist you want to be. Do you want to be the kind of socialist who emulates imperial scavengers like Norway that are top weapons producers? Or do you want to show solidarity with countries where socialist projects are actually underway in the global south? And I think a lot of young people are coming towards the latter tendency. And those are the people I'm meeting on the road. Basically, what I do is just go talk about journalism. I don't talk about, ideological theory or anything. But the journalism we're doing is just busting the lie of the day, and every day there's just a new lie. And again, people are just deeply suspicious of it. The, there's just such a desperate desire among the national security state for some young people to back up their lies, and that's why you see sites like Bellingcat getting so much elite promotion, because it's like the one group of young or youthful people who are willing to put energy into backing up the national security state's deceptions through this really phony model of crowdsourced journalism, which actually isn't journalism because they don't go anywhere.
Yeah, that's quite a that's quite a story in itself, the whole Bellingcat thing. Hey, you could be elevated quickly and get lots of resources from, Google and the Atlantic Council, and if you're willing to do that. But I
Yeah,
guess the fact that so few people do is an encouraging thing.
the first thing they did today was to try to validate CENTCOM claims that a mine had been planted in the Japanese tanker in the Gulf of Oman. And if you look at their Twitter thread, it's just pathetic. The thread falls apart as the captain of the ship said that no mine was planted and that a flying object hit it. So, like, whoops, I'll take the captain's word
It's quite a
over,
little different. Yeah.
yeah, over a bunch of nerds in an air-conditioned office who are just kind of examining these blurry, grainy, black and white CENTCOM images. And that
Led
really,
by the lingerie salesman, right?
yeah, I mean, and it's their biggest hit was on Skripal. I still don't know if they proved anything there, but basically they got the identities of these two Russians who were in
Oh, I
South
remember.
England.
Yeah.
It wasn't like they got those identity cards or their passports through some digital Sherlocking. They got them because they were passed to them by NATO or some intelligence agency, and so they basically became the PR arm of British intelligence.
And they
And
had they had closed circuit still shots from like airport jetways, right? So where are you
you
going to get those?
who gave him the passports? Like, come on, that's not
Yeah.
it's not like crowdsourced journalism. That is called being a amplifying mechanism for the deep state. And then Elliot Higgins shows up on like British talk shows as the man of the moment, and the New Yorker profiles him, and it's just ridiculous. So anyway, that the point of Bellingcat is to kind of counter the organic rise of authentic anti-imperialist and independent journalism, and this sort of surge among youth, this hunger among youth for challenging the dominant national security state narrative.
And just for something that makes sense, Max, because that's another reason why uh, the curtain's being pulled back on this is because the narratives that they have to hang out there are just so nonsensical. And the supporting Al Qaeda or Al Qaeda allied quote unquote rebels in Syria is the most notable one, of late. But it's just none of it makes sense, and so it just makes. I'm not at all surprised that people are drawn to something that makes sense, and it's very complicated. There are some very talented liars, very well supported, well funded liars, but I don't know. People do seem to have a just an instinct for knowing when they're being told the truth. I mean, yeah, we could be lied to pretty well too, I guess you could say, but you can kind of detect when somebody's, telling you the truth.
Well, it's all happening really below the radar. I don't know how it's going to manifest in any political sense, since this country is really deteriorating as a democracy to the extent that it ever was one. It's much harder to have your voice heard in any democratic sphere. But when the coup attempt was launched against Venezuela in January, the Answer Coalition held a national march in Washington. It actually took place in March, so several weeks after the coup attempt was launched. And there was a teach-in afterwards at a church in Washington. And the church was completely packed from the stage to the back of the room
Wow.
with 800 people who are mostly young people. And talking to them, about how they got into this whole issue and got into politics at all was really, um, it was remarkable and inspiring, because they would talk about how they just, you know, they had just kind of organically come to an anti-imperialist perspective or gotten interested in socialism in recent months or in recent years, and how excited they were about it. So it was clearly something new taking place, and to see 800 people sitting there without being on young people without being on their phones for 3 hours, with their attention completely turned to Venezuela. It was really encouraging, and the different podcasts, websites. Every time they were mentioned from the stage, there was just this gale of applause from the crowd.
Wow.
So there's clearly a lot of um, attention to independent media, and I think the corporate model has just fallen apart. One of the things that I'm hoping will sink in um, through this campaign is the kind of contempt for corporate media that we've seen on the right, that Trump has tried to stoke. I would love to see, Bernie Sanders tap into that. And I actually, find it ridiculous when I see all these corporate preening journalists in the Beltway press corps at the, White House press correspondents dinner, whining about Trump's attacks on the media and claiming they're being victimized, like they're in an authoritarian dictatorship, and that they're unsure if they can open this or that package on their porch, when like they really deserve to be hated. Like, they have lied us into war. They helped lie us into a financial crisis and then helped cover it up. They are just one of the worst elements, and they deserve to be mocked and to be treated with contempt. But obviously, they don't deserve to be threatened. But these people are completely talentless and they act as if they deserve to be some kind of protected class. And I think it's a good thing. It would be a great thing if a progressive candidate would go out and offer a kind of a progressive critique on corporate media. And that would be a great thing for independent media. So far, again, Tulsi Gabbard's the only candidate I see shouting out any independent figures or sites in the media, and Bernie hasn't really been on top of this. And there's another thing that Bernie's fallen victim to, which is this fake Madeleine Albright binary of the world of liberalism versus authoritarianism, and that we need to spread. He really is talking about promoting democracy, which is code for reinvestment in U.S. soft power, which is exactly what was at the heart of Madeleine Albright's ridiculous book on fascism, which she never defines. And so Bernie talks about, the rising China and Russia as an authoritarian bloc, and he thinks of the U.S. as this true, authentic, projection of liberalism. It's really dangerous, and it speaks to how pliable he is becoming.
Right. And I've talked about this in a couple of podcasts, and include one of them with Alan McLeod. And, from Bernie's previous statements, we know that he doesn't believe this. We know that he, at least at one point, understood very clearly what was going on. And to hear him, talk about how Maduro's election, we need to have new elections, this sort of taking the ball, the regime change ball, like halfway down the field or to the 10-yard line, and then just letting the Hawks pick it up and run the rest of the way. It's very disturbing. And I have, just like I did for Obama, I have more respect for them than to believe that they have just fallen for this. I think maybe more likely to me, they see it as a survival mechanism. We could be more hopeful and say he's just saying this now and it's a Trojan horse, or, he's really got more sensible foreign policy views. But it's very, very worrisome, because I know that he knows better, just like I know that Obama knew better, or at least I thought he did. And that's the end of part 1. Thank you for listening. A special thanks to Max Blumenthal. Follow Max on Twitter at Max Blumenthal. Find and support his work at thegrayzone.com and at moderaterebels.com. Around the Empire is listener-supported independent media. Pitch in if you can. Patreon.com/AroundTheEmpire. PayPal.me/AroundTheEmpirePod. There are many ways to find and listen to Around the Empire audio podcast. Find and subscribe on your favorite mobile podcast app, or listen to it on the website aroundtheempire.com, or on Patreon, patreon.com/AroundTheEmpire, or on YouTube, youtube.com/AroundTheEmpire. If you're listening on YouTube, please hit the thumbs up to like the video, leave me a comment, and don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.